Welcome, everyone. It's great to see a packed room today. For those of you whom I haven't met, I'm Robert Nichols. I'm chair of the History of Consciousness Department, and welcome to everyone here for this special event as part of our research colloquium. So today we're here to talk about revolution and restoration, the politics of anachronism, by our very own Massimiliano Tomba. Professor Tomba is a professor here in our department, and this work is really the continuation of a larger project and several publications, most recently Insurgent Universality. So if you like what you hear, there's lots more of it that comes from. So the format for today, and we're experimenting with a few different kinds of formats and different ways of introducing topics and discussing them. Today, we're going to start off with two of the PhD students from our departments, Ariella Patchen and Shaun are going to present. They're going to offer their thoughts and reflections on the work for about 10 or 15 minutes each, and then followed by Professor Tomba and the remaining discussion. So join me in welcoming Ariella and Shaun, and I'll turn it over to you.
Me? Oh, I thought it was you.
Oh, no.
Great. Okay. In Marxism and the Philosophy of Language, Valentin Voloshinov writes, the ruling class strives to impart a superclass, eternal character to the ideological sign. If successful, this would make impossible any, quote, struggle between social value judgments, end quote, in converting language into a homogeneous, transparent, uncontestable form. By this logic, the ruling class always seeks to construct a grammar that neutralizes popular demands. What passes for class-neutral language is, as Voloshinov writes, quote, an arena of the class struggle, end quote. Dominant forces naturalize and universalize ruling class meanings, rendering invisible class conflicts traces in our values, discourse, and practices. If the ruling class got their way, we could only communicate and organize our lives according to terms that pose no threat to the ruling power. In Revolution and Restoration, Tomba analyzes the attempt at total capitalist hegemony by looking at its temporal strategies. Temporal, Brian is going to show that. Modern domination doesn't only universalize meanings, it also universalizes a temporal grammar, a way of sorting practices, institutions, and demands into what counts as progressive or regressive, timely or untimely, viable or obsolete. Here, Tomba argues that modernity is no unified temporal medium within which politics happens, but a contested temporal order produced through synchronizing projects and resisted through the persistence and return of non-synchronous practices. Tomba theorizes this at the level of method. He insists that theory must begin from struggle, indeed from the way concepts themselves bear antagonistic traces. He writes, for instance, quote, the laissez-faire theory, like every theory, was born on a battlefield and bears the traces of its opponents, end quote. Tomba's procedure is therefore neither to adapt to the, quote, new legal and disciplinary system, end quote, as modern reason's neutral standpoint, nor to romanticize what modernity has defeated in some sort of prelapsarian fantasy. On the contrary, when older temporal layers reactivate under new pressures, quote, their reinvention is at stake, end quote. At the heart of this temporal struggle is progress. Appearing as a neutral aspect of modern historical development, progress functions as a political grammar striving for total hegemony. Its normative force works through elite institutions' synchronization of diverse social rhythms. By a stroke of luck for the ruling classes, linear progress delegitimates older values, institutions, practices, and other forms of social life, rendering them archaic, premature, regressive, or untimely distractions or disruptions, and thus less valuable than prevailing modern forms. This plotting of social forms onto a timeline is what Tomba calls reverse teleology. The state consolidates the present by imposing a public historical narrative and a uniform legal and calendrical framework. Quote, a calendar of national celebrations and a homogeneous legal system that pulverizes juridical anachronisms, end quote. While capital synchronizes through the discipline of labor time and competitive regulation. Supposing that any people's metaphysics must correspond with their way of life, then the state and its appendages administer capitalism's metaphysics. As progress's very schema is one of the state's and capital's synchronizing techniques, revolution thus can't mean progress's acceleration. However, Tomba writes, quote, capital generates a multiplicity of temporal frictions, asynchronies, and asynchronisms that release possibilities of emancipation and reorientation, end quote. Even modernity's highly effective temporal weapon, progress, can't keep people's unshakable desire for justice and for healthy and thriving communities from outflanking the attempt to create a totalizing grammar. When society's prevailing form appears to be an impenetrable solid crystal, alternative views and practices re-emerge from buried layers of past insurgencies. They whisper to the struggling oppressed classes tales of incomplete attempts at justice, waiting to be fully redeemed in the present. Tomba thus treats insurgent politics as the reactivation of forms that the dominant temporality relegates to the supposed past, but these anachronistic forms persist sedimented in the present. Instead of mere repetitions, such reemergences entail transformation. Quote, there are mutations that result from the reconfiguration of different temporal layers and temporalities, end quote. Tomba gives the example of the diggers. I keep saying Tomba. I don't know how you feel about that. He gives the example of the diggers, writing that their tilling wasn't just economic and agrarian. In fact, quote, they were excavating temporal and historical strata, end quote. Such reactivations force a new configuration of property, authority, and membership. Quote, by reactivating anachronistic temporal strata, these experiments anticipate other forms of ownership, ways of practicing politics, citizenship, and obligations, end quote. The proximity of the terms revolution and restoration doesn't signal a rhetorical paradox, but a claim about political temporality. Tomba reframes the contemporary revolutionary horizon by rejecting futurist notions of legitimacy. As he puts it, quote, our present witnesses more humble insurgencies whose temporality is the now here, end quote. These insurgencies are politically intelligible only once we've abandoned the demand that movements justify themselves by appealing to a future state form. They're, quote, political experiments with law, property, political participation, and citizenship that do not seek their legitimacy in a future to be realized, but instead refer to the authority of legal systems and traditions, end quote. Commons, councils, and sanctuary function as exemplary sites of this kind of activation, practical resources for puncturing the law's prevailing form and inventing political possibilities from within modernity's layered field. The upshot is a conflict between the homogeneous time that stabilizes hierarchy and the plural times in which subaltern struggles reactivate buried forms as resources for justice. Only in the last 5 minutes of human history has linear progress functioned as a normative instrument for reproducing social hierarchy against a far longer inheritance of shared orientations, rituals, and cycles. In Tomba's theorization, this ongoing modern struggle indexes the impossibility of a static social order and unlocks paths toward possible universal justice. The book thus reconstructs key forms through which such now-here insurgency become intelligible: social property, the imperative mandate, sanctuary, as reactivations of sedimented strata. Tomba's method then hinges on treating social forms not as neutral containers for politics, but as historically produced unities whose coherence is always provisional. Tomba makes this explicit at the level of concept formation. In opposition to a kind of political nominalism, concepts aren't mere innocent names. They're temporalizing devices that sort practices into timely and untimely, and thereby constitute a politics of time. Through reversal teleology, we silently treat the present as the standard that explains the past, making the dominant form appear as the only mature outcome. Aufhebung thus assures that under the owl of Minerva's wings, any alternative to the ruling class's imposed forms is a merely regressive residue to be crushed and forgotten. For Tomba, though, the stability of a form is never a settled fact. It's an achievement of power, continually haunted by what is displaced. Forms therefore have a morphology, an inner articulation of relations, rights, obligations, and practices that's internally conflictual and historically layered. New concepts always arrive with a dead. They condense and reorganize, quote, tensions between incompatible systems, end quote, and under pressure can yield mutations as different temporal layers collide and recombine. Transformation is imminent to the field because the very forms that dominate modernity remain open totality, structured, durable, and yet shot through with antagonisms that can be activated from within. Tomba is no magician, it turns out. And the beyond opened by revolutionary practice is never the leap to an external norm, a transhistorical foundation, or another reality. Instead, Tomba's is a relative transcendence, a practical excess, I feel that. A practical excess of an instituted order from within the historical field that order organizes. Modernity never fully purges the supposedly obsolete past. Sedimented forms within concepts and practices lay available for reactivation when conflict reopens their meaning. Tomba's concept of sedimentation depicts history not as a homogeneous linear flow, but as a multi-layered terrain of accumulated meanings, practices, and legal forms. Rather than being superseded or left behind, past social forms persist as, quote, historical layers that are co-present yet temporally distinct, end quote, which can clash or intermingle with the dominant order. Tomba thus positions himself in a materialist tradition that emphasizes these deep temporal strata. In his view, older modes of life and thought aren't simply erased by progress. Quote, deep temporal strata are not superseded, but run beneath modernity's surface, ready to resurge when the energy released by their friction can no longer be contained, end quote. Historical change is thus a stratigraphic process. New political forms emerge not ex nihilo, but from friction and interaction between layered social structures. Tomba can thus describe contemporary insurgencies as experiments that appeal to the authority of alternative legal traditions that the dominant order has deemed untimely. For the same reason, justice is no abstract tribunal above politics. Even the appeal to natural right isn't an escape from history, but one of its weapons. Quote, jus naturale is a battle term, end quote. Just as the diggers excavated temporal and historical strata, insurgent practices can reopen suppressed layers of legality and community. In so doing, they reshape the internal arrangement of powers, rights, and obligations, making it possible to work on a form's internal configuration, its structure of reproduction, until it yields. This excavation then grasps what's transcendent relative to the dominant logic, a practical beyond produced from within the historical field itself. Left of flight beyond the world and the reconsideration of standing habits, it offers the possibility of collectively and creatively reconfiguring the world's own layered resources of justice. To name Tomba's method revolutionary stratigraphy is to make explicit what's operative in his examples. Politics is work on a thick present composed of historical layers, and critique is the practice of identifying which buried layers still exert force and can be reactivated. Stratigraphy names political life's morphology. Social forms have a determinate shape, an internal organization of powers, rights, habits, and institutions. But that shape is never a simple unity. It's a layered composition produced by defeats, compromises, survivals, and returns. A stratigraphic reader therefore asks, which layer rules here? Which layer is suppressed? And what happens when a suppressed layer resurfaces under present pressures? Concepts like democratic excess and insurgent universality point the way. Democratic excess is what happens when popular practices overflow the state's synchronized order of politics, when democracy appears not as a properly timed procedure, but as an untimely practice that disorganizes the state form. Tomba is explicit that democratic excess should be treated as a contested term and reclaimed as a diagnostic and strategic concept. Although it, quote, was coined as a negative description, quote, his aim is to, quote, to reappropriate it to show how it reshapes property, political participation, and citizenship, end quote. Democratic excess names a morphological shift in the political field, not an external replacement of one system by another, but an internal reconfiguration in which older and marginal forms, assemblies, recall, councils, sanctuary practices, become active forces that alter what democracy, property, and citizenship mean in the present. This is why Tomba can define democratic excess in the book's own idiom as a practical challenge to the modern state's temporal sovereignty. Its control over social life's timing and tempo, as, quote, a set of practices that challenge the dominant temporality, end quote. Insurgent universality then names what happens when these apparently local excesses connect across sites, struggles, and even historical periods into a universalism that doesn't descend from the state's abstract rights form. In Tomba's close reading of the declarations that oriented the French Revolution, he draws a sharp contrast. Insurgent universality isn't the juridical universalism of 1789. It's an insurgent universalism that breaks, quote, open the political form of the state and presses toward radical change, end quote. It is, as he puts it, the excess of equality and freedom beyond the juridical frame of universal rights, announcing, quote, a politics beyond the state, end quote. This universality isn't a finished blueprint. Insurgent universality, quote, takes place at a practical epistemic level, in the incompleteness of each structure, forging bridges and connections between different political experiments, end quote. If democratic excess is the resurfacing of a suppressed layer in a given conjuncture, insurgent universality is the formation of a shared horizon, when such resurgences become mutually legible, mutually reinforcing across a stratified historical field. Revolution and Restoration then isn't a mere collection of historical case studies. It's an argument about how emancipatory politics can be imminent without being trapped in the reproduction of the present. Neither does emancipatory politics have to reproduce the conditions that brought it about, nor does it require any miraculous intervention from the heavens. Instead, Tomba's method shows that even today, radical political strategy and meaningful practice are still possible. The past matters because the present is stratified. Modernity's synchronizing grammar leaves residual alternative layers, and those layers can be practical resources. Tomba's theoretical directive, then, isn't to restore a lost world, but to break with linear teleology and grasp history as a, quote, vertical stratification of temporalities, end quote, capable of reactivation in the present. When sedimentation is understood as the material persistence of layered forms, relative transcendence is no paradox, and instead appears as the very logic of revolutionary action in a world where the new never materializes by incantation or children's wishes, but is made by activating unrealized potentials already compressed in the presence of layered morphology. 10 years ago, Tomba wrote, quote, "The current crisis expresses a violent resynchronization of temporalities that are out of sync," end quote. What we should learn isn't that we ought to impose some new violent resynchronization, even in, or perhaps especially in, these dark times, when so much of what's been buried violently erupts in morbid forms. The time may be ripe for anachronistic practices to help us to get time back into joint and to bridge struggles towards shared emancipation. Tomba's work suggests that the way forward lies in what's been left behind, in our ancestors' sedimented dreams, which, if reactivated, can help us to chart a course beyond the limits of the present.
Thank you.
Tomba's Revolution and Restoration, the Politics of Anachronism, offers a rich way of thinking about political alternatives. And I'd like to begin by briefly sketching what I see as some of its central contradictions before turning to a question of the book open for me. I want to situate the book as an intervention into how we understand political time itself, not as a linear progression, but as a layered field in which suppressed or out-of-sync forms remain active and can be called upon in the present. At the center of the book is a reconsideration of how political alternatives emerge. Rather than imagining transformation as something that comes from projecting a radically new future or inventing entirely new forms from scratch, Tomba asks us to look at the present as a site where multiple temporalities and institutional forms coexist and come into conflict with one another. He argues that dominant temporal frameworks attempt to synchronize diverse forms of life, even as alternative temporalities continue to persist. Practices that appear anachronistic, forms like the commons, assemblies, obligations, sanctuary traditions, are not treated simply as remnants of the past. They are within the present and can be reactivated in ways that generate new alternatives. From this perspective, new political configurations emerge not from pure invention, but from clashes between incompatible systems, between private property and the commons, between representative democracy and forms of direct mandate, between national sovereignty and local or religious practices of sanctuary. These tensions are marked by these encounters between institutional forms that are not meant to and often cannot fully align. As Tomba argues, these are fruitful anachronisms, formed by existing tension with dominant temporalities that create conditions for opening up possibilities. One of the most critical aspects of the book for me is insisting that these tensions are not simply transitional moments on the way to resolution. Conflict does not necessarily culminate in synthesis. It can linger, haunt, persist. And it is in that persistence that new conceptual political possibilities take shape. Tomba describes this as a kind of virtuous instability, an instability that derives from politics itself and from ongoing disputes over justice. Democracy, in this sense, is not primarily a constitutional form, but the excess that emerges through conflict with the possibility of disordering the existing order and reinventing new institutional frameworks, even if this may generate instability. What this offers then is a meaningful way to think about how alternatives emerge through conflict. It shifts the emphasis away from imagining a wholly new future and towards understanding how past practices continue to reappear in ways that unsettle dominant forms. Restoration in this sense is not a simple return to what existed, but an ongoing mode of political action that unfolds within temporally unfinished landscapes, one in which blocked futures can be reopened. What I found myself wondering has to do with the duration of these tensions and with the forms of practice that allow them to be sustained. If incompatibility is the condition through which alternatives emerge, then political life may involve learning how to remain within those tensions over time. Tomba offers powerful historical and conceptual accounts of movements that operate within asynchronous temporalities and conflict and come up against institutional forms. At the same time, these examples also suggest that sustaining such instability requires both social and effective labor, ways of remaining in relation across disagreement, a way of tolerating unresolved conflict, and a way of continuing collective activity even when tensions are not fully resolved. In the many movements Tomba draws on, from the diggers to the zapatistas, we see examples of collective life organized with an ongoing intention. These examples point to the fact that incompatibility is not only a structural condition, but something that must be lived. It must be endured, negotiated, and maintained. If alternatives emerge from clashes between forms that do not fully converge, then they also depend on practices that allow people to inhabit those clashes without collapsing them too quickly. This raises the questions of what kind of relational practice allows people to remain in such a state. What enables movement to continue operating within this instability? And what does it mean to engage politically in ways that don't presume that incompatibility will ultimately disappear? These questions are important if we think about restoration not as a singular act of retrieval, but as an ongoing mode of engagement. Restoration here appears less as recovery than as a repeated interaction with practices that remain out of sync. This may not only involve reactivating anachronistic forms, but also sustaining the conflict that they generate, holding open spaces that remain productive precisely because they are not and cannot fully be resolved. For me, then, one of the central questions that's open is about these conditions that Tomba describes. The clashes between asynchronous temporalities and incompatible institutional forms are inhabited collectively. Alternatives emerge from instability. They also depend on practices of that instability, ways of remaining in question in relation across disagreement. What I hope we can think about together is how those conflicts are lived and maintained, not only as historical or institutional dynamics, but as ongoing conditions of collective life.
Thank you. So thank you very much. Very, very generous introduction and also some past questions I have tried to address them. So one thing I want to say as a kind of an introduction, usually people begin with an autobiographical note, and I wanna do the same thing. The autobiographical note is very simple. It was difficult to put together this book for some reason. It was much more difficult than when I wrote Insurgent Universality. There are parts of this book that I had to write 7, 8, 9 times. I was really concerned about myself, and then I thought, what is going on? I had all this time. I was in Princeton. I had a fellowship. I was not teaching, and then I thought, okay, maybe is a personal crisis. Is a COVID. I'm aging, and my mental capabilities are deteriorating. That's also possible. So there are, many possible answers. But it's true that I had to rewrite pieces many times, and the language, and I redefined the language more over and over. So, and probably I was also concerned about something that it emerged today. That is say the proximity and the difference between my previous book, Insurgent Universality and Revolution of Restoration. So Robert generously says they are part of the same project. Yes, they are. But the question is, what is the difference? And the third, I remember that when there was the book was published with the Fordham University Press, but before going to Fordham, for a little while, I was in conversation with Angela Chinacco of Oxford University. And I asked her, I said, what if I give a title to this book and then the subtitle is Insurgent Universality #2. You didn't like it. No, it doesn't work. Why not? My fellow Italian Agamben, he did it, almost such a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's say it's the Italian signature. She said no. Okay, and then it was good that she said no, because I had to think more and more what is the difference between these two books. And I think now I hope it's clear to me what is the difference. And in a few words, so in Insurgent Universality doesn't really emphasize the insurgent. Some reviews and some people who cite insurgent universality, they like the insurgent dimension. And even if they use insurgent in a very different context, sometimes there is a footnote, see Tomba, for what? I didn't invent the word insurgent, so it's not my business. So, and people think it's about insurgent and insurgency. No, it's not so much. I think the real thing there was what is the universality, and I think Shaun and Ariella pointed out is the tension between universalism and universality. So the starting point of the book at the time was the tension between the 1789 French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the 1793 Declaration. I don't want to go back there, so the word is done already. But that was the big thing, and universality, even in that declaration, is something that basically already, as this language of reactivation of natural rights, reinvention of natural rights, and the form of universality that takes place in social practices, the commune, the assemblies, and the Soviet, and so on. And in these practices, what you can see is basically the idea that something that is local practices. They have, to use a term that Susan Buck-Morse used, they have a translocal dimension. They are not immediately cosmopolitan, but they exceed. They are locality. And so the book was about this excess. How is possible to have a politics that exceeds a local institution, a local forms of organization that exceeds local institutions and so on. And then basically is what is it? It's about the excess of the term man, if you want, of the term human being. Why? Because in all these examples, what you can find is this tension between the human being and the concept of a citizenship, and this excess of the human being is something that breaks this binary, this tension between citizens and alien, and the language. The point is that I didn't invent anything. The language of these insurgents was over and over the language of in their term was the man or the human being. This something that exceeds the category of a citizen, the category of whatever you want. So, and then I try to follow in that book this kind of alternative legacy of the excess of the democratic excess, the excess of the man, the human being, the excess of the universality over universalism, and so on and so forth. And the book ended with the Zapatistas case, and especially with their language of the world in which many words can fit. And I think this is still a very important message that the Zapatistas gave us. Because in my reading, the emphasis is not only on the many words, the muchos mundos, is more on the singular one word, un mundo. So the point is, the question is, how should the many words look like so that they can fit in one common word? So this one is to use a language that I usually don't use, is a kind of a normative direction. The one is not achieved, and probably the one is unachievable. But the one is a what gives a form to our practice and changes the way we relate to each other. And so insurgent universality was working with this tradition. So I think the subtitle, to conclude, the subtitle of that book is more important than the title. And the subtitle was An Alternative Legacy of Modernity. Was to find this alternative legacy and follow this alternative legacy in different examples. Now, revolution restoration has a different task. I think is actually more theoretical than insurgent universality, because this book is about the production and reconfiguration of political and legal concepts. It's about how concepts can be generated or configured in concrete social practices. And to do that, the book goes through 3 examples. There is the Cochabamba, there is the water wars, there is the imperative mandate in some populist movement, and there is the sanctuary cities. So basically, the 3 examples are what? Property, democracy, citizenship, right? So Cochabamba is about social property, water in that conflict that took place in 2000. The imperative mandate is a democratic institution, so it's about democracy, and then citizenship, centrality. So, and I even play in the book at a certain point with the kind of a repartition that you can find in a classic Roman law, that is jus civile, private law, jus publicum, public law, and jus gentium, international law. So basically, what is going on there is these 3 examples are there to question with the concrete practice. There's a partition of the law in these 3 dimensions: private, public, international. It's not only a critique of this partition, it's not only a critique of the concept of international or public or private law. There is a more important part, constructive dimension. So it's about with what can we replace with these concepts. So the point is how in these conflicts, in these tension, new concepts can emerge. So, and I think this is a little bit, going back to what Ariella said at the very end what is the task of us as a thinker in a certain way, and I would say the task of us as a scholars, as a thinkers, is has to be a very humble task in my opinion, and I think. Revolution or restoration is difficult to read. I don't know, maybe not, but it's a humble book. It doesn't provide any recipe. It doesn't say, oh, this is the way to restore democracy. It doesn't do any of these things. Insurgent, the revolution and restoration is just it is an attempt to think with the anonymous activists and insurgents. So it's a way to basically take into consideration that something emerged in these social practices. And our task as a thinker is just to develop, enlarge these concepts that emerge in social practices. And they emerge how? This is the question now, and we go back to another point. This is a language of tension, conflict, filled full of forces, and so on. How do they emerge? The concept emerge, as I said, emerge in concrete tensions. And I can give you an example. In the modern war in Cochabamba, the concept of social property emerged in the tension between private property and state or public property. So the activists at a certain point say they need a law, and they wanted to break this binary, or to put it in a different way, they wanted, or they did work within the tension between these two concepts. So, and I think this is important because it goes back to the point of being humble. So this is important. Why? Because if these concepts are configured in this attention, it also means that a huge amount of a social political energy is required to reconfigure concepts. This is a point I make over and over in the book. New concepts are not the result of free thinking. They don't emerge in the head of a very smart intellectual. So the bad news is we scholars, we don't produce concepts. Oh, this is what I think. We don't. But we, because to give a shape, a new shape to concepts, as I say, energy is required, social energy. Why? Now, this is the interesting point, in my opinion, because these new concepts, they constitute a challenge that has to be addressed. Now, what the scholars do is actually the opposite of what we think they do. What they do is they try to domesticate these new emerging concepts. This is what they do. They create a counter concept. They create polemical concepts that, because of a high level of abstraction, can basically reduce the intrinsic excess of a concept produced in social events and structures. I give you an example, otherwise it sounds very abstract and it doesn't make sense. And then I stop so we can have a real conversation. So I stop with this example. Let's take equality equality emerged in early modernity as a new radical concept. There was a kind of an excessive equality that emerged in many practices. Most of them in Europe were religious practices, radical forms of Christianity, and so on and so forth. And they practice a form of radical equality that was extremely disruptive for the existing order. Now, the point is what is possible to do with this kind of a radical, excessive equality? I would say you can do a few things. One is you can try to repress and kill all these insurgent movements and the practices of radical equality. As that requires just a gigantic amount of violence, but you can do it. History is open to violence. The second thing is you can embrace the excess of equality. This is what in Germany happened to the peasants and Thomas Milzer. But usually you end pretty bad. So basically, usually you get killed. And the third way to go is to do, I think you use the term, to do an Aufhebung, really the Hegelian Aufhebung. So the meaning is, in Hegel, Aufhebung means negation, means to preserve, and it means a third element, it means to raise at a higher level. This is exactly what you do practically in history. You negate equality as a kind of an insurgent equality, but you preserve equality. You still have equality, but you turn equality into abstract equality, that is the equality you have at the legal level. Equality before the state, equality in a trial, equality of the legal personal. This is a very smart way to neutralize the insurgent character of equality. In a way that we still have equality, but this is my point, that equality that we still kind of alive, we say, oh, equality is a good thing, you know, and is a polemical concept. That our concept of equality was born as a polemical concept against the disruptive, insurgent character of the equality practiced by many movements. So, what revolution and restoration tries to do, this is the anachronism, and this is my last point, is basically tries to question our concept of equality or democracy or other political concepts by reanimating the anachronistic form of the excess, so that this concept that we still use is again open to different outcomes and possibilities. Possibilities that we cannot predict. We don't see the future, we don't foresee the future. But what we can do is try to recombine pieces of the past and the present in a new way. When I say we, and I really stop, it's not we, it's not Max Tomba. I don't recombine pieces of the past. Yes, I can do it, but then I write a novel. No, the point is how in social experiments and practices these pieces of past and present are recombined. So the point is that to do this work, that is, in my opinion, highly theoretical, a gigantic amount of history is required. So, and in a certain way, the invitation of a revolution or restoration is really to take back the study of history for theory, and the other way around, and theory for the historians, obviously, because to do history without theory is also meaningless. That's it. It's not meaningless. It's to do history without the theory now because I didn't know how to finish my sentence. So to do history without the theory, it means that basically we are not aware of what we are doing. So it's a kind of it's only an expression of a lack of a self-reflexivity. Because if we don't do history with theory, it means that the theory is basically working behind our shoulder. It's not possible to do history, to represent, to organize things without the categories and concepts. This is the point. So better to be aware of what we are doing. And this is what they would call being self-reflexive. Yeah.
Okay, so we have lots of time for questions, discussion. Feel free to address questions both to Max, but also to Shaun, to Ariella, and those of you in the Zoom, if you have a question, just raise your hand and I can come up. I've got Shaun, and you.
Thank you, Max, for this. I look forward to reading your book. I haven't read it, so in case the answer is already written, but that would make it easier for you, I guess. I'm wondering if there are booby traps in the book for right-wing readers. So in other words, what is the difference between a revolutionary restoration for a concept like equality than a revolutionary restoration for a concept like racial superiority, white supremacy, etc.? Is there something inherent in the book that would prevent the less favorable, in your eyes, I would imagine, kind of reading?
Yeah, okay, I can try to answer in a few seconds if I there are more time for questions. Yes, there is a room in the book for conservative and right-wing thinkers and so on, and right-wing movements as well. And I would say a couple of things. The first one is that I would say this is the problem of what we usually call the left, if you will. So the right wing was able to pick up everything the left has abandoned. Concepts like tradition, restoration, natural law, religion, and so on, in the name of secularism. What is interesting, for every single concept I mentioned now, I listed now, you have to think there is a counter concept. This is the idea, they are when we use the word secularism, is a polemical concept. It's not something idea, but it is just a polemical concept, and so on and so forth. So the point is that the right wing has been able to mobilize all these ideas, these terms, that for centuries were actually the arsenal of the left and progressive forces or emancipatory forces. So they, you know, when I wrote for the first time this paragraph, I saw that the right wing as a stolen, and then I thought, no, actually they didn't steal any because the left just abandoned. The right wing, they only tended to pick up what the left had abandoned. So the first thing is because of these terms emerge in tension, they can go in both directions. They can go in a conservative direction, in a more emancipatory direction, even natural law that today is mostly used by conservative parties. But there is a radical black natural law tradition and so on and so forth. So my point is the outcome is not predetermined, it's not certain. The point is that the outcome is the result of this battlefield in which all these terms has to be understood and used as a battle terms. This is where I would stop. And just to be, you know, my invitation is to be bold, courageous enough to reappropriate these terms and to use it. And because we don't gain anything if we leave these terms in the hands of the conservative forces.
I have two questions. One is very related to that, but I'm gonna frame it in a different way. I'm interested in the concepts, as you were saying. And it seems that we are in a moment now where in which social energy is in the right side of the political spectrum, right? And I've been listening recently to a lot of people worried about the situation, talking and now questioning about different ideas. So I'm interested in the concept that you mentioned. So in terms of revolution and restoration, if this social energy is placed in that place, in that side, will this change or reframe, recategorize the idea of revolution in our times, in our current times? Because we can see that the right-wing movements, they are making a revolution. That's what they are making. Or what we are seeing here is just one of these layers ruling in this time, and then there will be another layer maybe ruling over this one, right? Maybe that's another idea to see it. But I'm interested in the concept also of the revolution and restoration in terms of the future. What is the role of future here and utopia? If we remember the term utopia from Latin, it's like non-place. It's a non-place. It doesn't happen. What didn't exist in the past. So we want something in the future that we still don't know. We don't have, right? So how do you see that from this point of view of this book and your work in social universality as well? How do you relate this concept with the future and utopia in this moment?
Well, I think a couple of things. Thank you. So the term revolution, the concept of revolution we have in mind is pretty much or follows the script of the French Revolution. And I think this is one of our problems, that we expect revolution to happen in a certain way that more or less follows that script. Take power, you change, you take power, you have a control of the state, and then because you have a control of the state, you can reshape society. This is what happened with the French Revolution. I think this is also what the Bolsheviks wanted to do. But the language of the insurgents in the 18th century, 19th century was not that language of a revolution. It was much more the language of restoring the social fabric, restoring the fabric of social institutions that actually had been destroyed by the state. So it's the opposite of the script. So the point is that was the language. And when I say revolution and restoration, this is just an adaptation. I'm not inviting anybody to choose between revolution or restoration. Is my invitation is to think in the tension between the two terms and the social practice that can be changed by this attention. Now, what you call utopia is to me the novel, the something really new that can emerge. And this is something that can emerge, in my opinion, in that attention, and can emerge when past and present recombine in a new, unexpected way. This is how the new can emerge. The really new can emerge, because if we think that it's possible to have a kind of a prefiguration of a utopia, then I think philosophically it's an easy game to show that this conception doesn't go anywhere. Why? Because basically, this prefiguration of your utopia can only be built with the concepts and categories which are available to you now. So basically, your prefiguration of the future is only an extension of the present. For that reason, between the new and the present, there is a need for new concepts, for new or reconfigured concepts that we as individual thinkers cannot produce. We don't have that force to do it. We can invent neologisms, words, but not concepts. They can emerge. And when they emerge, they open up this tension. Ariella and Shaun were talking about, the tension between different temporalities, the tension between present and anachronism and so on. So, and the point is also to answer their question. It's not, oh, therefore we need a new conception of a plural temporalities. That has been done. This is not my point. My point is not that if we pluralize temporalities, this is the way out. Because what I think is important is not the pluralization of temporalities or being aware that there are many temporalities. The point is that there are dominant temporalities which synchronize many different temporalities. The point is how you stop and break the mechanism of a synchronization. This is the thing. So anachronism is about a piece of sand in the cog of a synchronization that can create a sufficient disruption in which something else can emerge. So it's about a synchronization and not about multiplying times and temporality.
Brian, and then I have a question from Mike on the Zoom.
So you characterize the kind of generation of proto concepts through social practice as distinct necessarily from like a generation of concepts that we have subsequently that kind of you characterize it in a way of defanging a social movement and rendering that into a new form, which is law or jurisprudence or whatever it is, that then kind of subsequently percolates through society as social practice that we practice through the exercise of human rights, whatever it is. So it seems like these two are fundamentally different. They're different actors. So there are two parts of my question. What happens, or how do we account for instances where those engaging in these practices are also involved in the conversion of these things into jurisprudential concepts that become enacted in new ways through law, etc. And also, does this necessarily mean that there's we can only expect a sort of failure between the concepts as understood or enacted or visualized in social practices and those that come about through their reconfiguration through these concepts that we see a lot?
What's the failure?
If it seems like there's a characterization of them as necessarily distinct. Like I said, there's a kind of sense of defanging the social movement that renders it. And that it almost seems like the people that are actually enacting this into law are working against those who are doing social practices. But it seems before this talk and before reading the book, one might expect, no, the simple notion is that there are these social movements that then become rendered into law and they're successful and that's great. We achieved equality, but you characterize it as a kind of, defanging. You're making it less revolutionary, less radical by pushing it into this law, by rendering it into a new form. And I'm wondering why there is that sense of defanging. Is it to draw attention to the fact that there is necessarily a sort of failure in the sense that the quality that was kind of rendering this proto concept into existence is necessarily more aspirational than what actually comes about? Are those necessarily discontinuous? Are they necessarily different actors? What happens when they are the same people? Is the outcome?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the right answer to that question should be found in historical examples, in my opinion. Or at least this is what comes to my mind. So, for example, let's assume that the Soviet experiment during the Russian Revolution was a radical experiment. Self-government, redefinition of property relations, and so on and so forth. In 1918, the Russians, they put together a constitution. Now, what is interesting is not to analyze the constitution, I did in my book, but is the Western reaction to that constitution. German legal scholars define that constitution as a pre-modern piece of medieval law, and so on and so forth. That is very interesting. So what I'm saying is that we have to really take into consideration what, if concepts are polemical concepts, we have really to pay attention to what conservatives are saying about these experiments. Because there is always half the truth in what they are saying. So when the legal scholars say, accuse the Russian constitution for being pre-modern, feudal, and so on and so forth, they were not totally wrong. Why? Because their constitution doesn't fit into the grammar of the Western modern law. So from their perspective, they were totally right. So the point is that you can formalize what happens in these social practices, disruptive movements. And it has been done many times. And I think this is something necessary, this is something we need to do. And the point is that when you try to do that, you are basically trying to redefine a new grammar, political, social, legal grammar, in which these new forms of togetherness can be redefined. And this is basically, there is a, why did I give you an example? Because I don't think there is a ready-made theoretical answer. This is just a field for experimentation. We can do experiments, and people do experiments, and the best we can do is try to learn from these experiments how a new legal grammar can emerge. This is the best we can do. And probably we will experiment for the next couple of hundred of years, if we have 200 years, and we will fail more and more. But the point is, how can this new grammar, and it will emerge by experimenting, not by writing a book. Because as I said with the equality, the book that we write are basically on the side of the production of a counter concept, and not on the side of the production of concepts. Because this is how concepts work. They work by creating abstraction. They work by producing Aufhebung. And the more they are abstract, the more they work as a polemical concepts. This is their work. But we can only think through concepts. And therefore, when we think in in a polemical way, even if we are not aware of what we do. So basically, the invitation is always the same. We need to be extremely self-reflexive of everything we are doing and how we play concepts in a certain way and not in another.
So we have 5 people in the stack, so
Oh,
maybe
wow.
shall we take questions
Yeah.
two at a time now?
Yeah.
Mike on Zoom and then Steve.
Yeah, that was really, really great. 2 apologies. The first is that I haven't read the book yet, so this might be a silly question. And the second apology is that you've already partially answered the question. But it occurred to me, I was reading about 2 years ago, I was reading this book, The Law of Blood, by this historian Chapoteau. It's all about the Nazi worldview. And I was really struck at the moment that a key part of the formation of the Nazi worldview was kind of these drawing on these ancient Greek and ancient Roman ideas. And at the time I was reading the book, I was involved in this kind of democracy activism stuff, and they were doing the exact same thing with like ancient Greece. And this is like deep sedimented concepts that are like, hundreds of years old. And so the first question, this just prompted, this was kind of a part of your response to the first question in the queue today. Are there conditions that you see under which right or reactionary movements take up old ideas versus revolutionary or kind of even reformist movements? I know you mentioned they're not predetermined and there's contingency, but I just wonder about if you have more kind of specified thoughts on that. If you think that there are actual conditions under which kind of old concepts can be restored in revolutionary or reactionary ways. And then the second, I was wondering if you could say maybe a little bit about the form in which these concepts are resurfaced. The kind of the Hegelian kind of form you mentioned, it suggests to me almost like a co-optation of equality by the right. The idea emerges as like a liberatory universalist concept, and it's eventually co-opted into the bourgeois state as this kind of property management thing. But that strikes me as quite different from like these ancient concepts, like that go back to ancient Greece, that resurface over, potentially much longer periods of time. And so I just wondered is there something to that, or is this kind of a non-issue? Anyway, thanks.
Stephen, go ahead.
Great. So something I've noticed, Max, is that in your work, we might say that there's an increasing turn to geologic metaphors. We have critique as abduction. We have sedimentary rock and things like this. And I'll try to just, I had more to say about geology as a sort of set of preparatory remarks to the question, but I'm going to actually just skip to the question, which is what, in your view, are the unique merits of geological metaphors for breaking synchronization? What is it about geologic metaphors specifically that sort of fire your imagination with respect to breaking synchronization? Why geologic metaphors as opposed to any other metaphors? Please.
Very nice.
I can go. Okay. I start from the metaphors. Why geological metaphor? Many reasons. One is also now. Okay, let's be. So for this reason, because I like the idea that the history is a layer, obviously, and I like the idea that in phenomenon like subduction, these layers can change their position. What I like is that yes, that is possible, but that requires the energy of an earthquake. This is what I like. It's not like there are layers and we can play with the layers and we move one and the other in different positions. No, that requires this kind of unexpected gigantic energy that is an earthquake. This is what I like. This is what I like. The reactionary, yes, they look, I think there is a reason they look at the past. I think actually there are two reasons. One is because the left has abandoned the idea of the past and restoring the social fabric. Why? Because the left has the idea that basically there is a direction, there is something like a normativity of a progress and future. The point is, unfortunately, that the normativity of the progress has become very weak. And I think this is not the only reason, but this is one among many, one reason why the right wing can play from this position of advantage because the weaponized normativity of progress that was used by the left at least for 200 years has lost its force. For that reason, it's easy for the right wing to mobilize the past, and this is one of I think one of the it's about what? It's basically about the same thing. Is that what we call past and future are again kind of a polemical concepts. They are concepts, ideas that can be weaponized. The concept of progress was a powerful way to weaponize and mobilize the idea of a future. When that possibility got lost, basically we are stuck either in presentism, the present becomes absolute, or there is a lot of nostalgia for the past. And the past is the good place where we should go back. But this is just a result of our weaponization of historical times. This is how I would put it. Yeah, probably there was something more, I think, but we will meet and we can talk.
Well, I just wonder, because one of the things that that I really focused on and that I find interesting about sedimentation is that it sort of makes nominalism impossible, it seems to me. It seems to me like one of the things that's useful is that, while epistemology and ontology or things like culture and nature and so on and so forth aren't exactly the same thing in how we think of them, that something like sedimentation makes it impossible to not think of them together, or to not think like the one without the other, rather. And I wonder if this is part of, like, for you, a way to like synthesize like a more sort of like monist approach in certain ways.
I think yes, you're right. You're right. It's not.
I just feel like a yes.
It's not that I play pluralism against monism. What I play is that every single concept has to be defined in constellations of concepts, and then I find tensions. So to me, even to talk about monism, pluralism, they make sense only when I think these two concepts together, and I think them in tension with each other. And because I don't give up on pluralism, but at the same time, as I say with the Zapatistas, I don't want to give up on the idea of the one world. So there is some element. Unity is something that cannot be refused. It's not, and we shouldn't be scared of the word unity. It's something that has to be addressed politically and theoretically. So
Questions? Nick and then Lisa on Zoom.
This might be slightly redundant following on the last two questions, but I wanted to invite you to say more about how you theorize the persistence of these anachronistic concepts or excesses in the present. Because if something is anachronistic and could be reactivated, that implies that it's not really in the past, it's still here. You've already the geological metaphor is already thinking about that. And something that occurs to me to come close to your beloved German peasants, with various heresies, the only reason we know anything about them today is because they were inscribed in heresy reports by the church. So the church can disavow this or that heresy, which would otherwise be totally lost to history because we don't have any writings from the actual heretics, but the heresy is inscribed in the record. It's like preserved in the record of the church. So this is one example. But yeah, how do you theorize this kind of untimely persistence before reactivation?
Lisa on Zoom, go ahead.
Hello, Lisa.
Hi. I confess to I only got the book a couple of days ago, so I'm only a few pages into it. But there's lots of food for thought here, and I am curious in order to like really get the most out of this book. We've heard about the geologic metaphors, but your use of the term synchronization of temporalities suggests to me that there's also a metaphor or a mental model based on waveforms. And I'm thinking like waveforms of different frequencies, which would contribute to the concept of synchronization. It seems it could also contribute to notions of how excesses at sometimes might be neutralized, for example, by deficiencies in another domain at the same time, sort of like the way waves can cancel each other out if they're in phase. So I'm wondering to what extent, can we play with that mental model in the reading of this book? And also too, just a comment, not really a question, but the terminology also reminded me of McLuhan's tetrad, enhance, obsolesce, retrieve, and reverse. You don't need to, well, if you want to speak to that, that would be great, but you don't have to. I'm more interested in the mental model and the wave metaphor.
To that, I don't know if this is going to make sense, but I found the kind of usage of revolution, restoration, refigure, this kind of prefix of the meaning like to go back versus, the emphasis on taking up a form or having it be solidified in the anachronism with Anna, the pre of Anna. I felt like I was wondering how you saw those working together, or if those are kind of existing amongst creating different types of ways of orienting towards time and backwardness and kind of.
To think about it. So, is a good question. So yeah, there is a persistence of anachronism in the present. And we are lucky that there is this persistence of anachronism, because even that the persistence is constantly threatened by what I call synchronization. So there are residual forms of different legalities and forms of property and so on. But where the state and capitalism, where they arrive, they synchronize. And the way they synchronize can be very violent or can be very soft, is by basically extending individual rights, laws, protection, and so on and so forth. Something that people usually accept and can even make their life better. We have to be, very, very aware about that. Now the point is what is that I think now you are pushing my pessimism. I think in what we call the West or Europe, this is a persistence of anachronism is really under threat. So is very residual. It's very residual. Obviously, it was very different when I talk about the German peasants, my favorite peasants, the German peasants in 1525. At that time, the conflict between these two incompatible worlds, universes, that conflict was enormous. Customary laws versus the new emerging centralization of the states, different forms of property. So that conflict ended in Germany with a massacre of 100,000 peasants. So the point is that the state had 500 years to do the aufhebung, to cancel, to supersede all these different anachronisms, these different forms of alternative forms of life and legalities and so on. It took a lot of time. It doesn't mean it doesn't. I think it's still possible. Something we say already, it's still possible to think about new tensions and new conflicts because capitalism creates over and over new tensions and new temporalities. But the point is that one can say that capitalism has also learned how to use these tensions and these temporalities, this conflict of temporalities. In a certain way, capitalism is really good in take advantage. Capitalism can benefit of these tensions. In a certain way, capitalism would die without these tensions, these conflict, and these different temporalities it needs. So now what? I think there is more room for different experiments that I'm pointing out in different parts of the world. But this is totally okay, So what the hell is Europe? It isn't just a narrow piece of the planet. So okay, it's done. Or maybe not, I don't know. But there are large portions of the planet in which these different temporalities are still in friction with each other. That is the place, there is the place where something interesting can emerge. And why not? You know, I'm happy to be surprised, and I'm happy to recenter the focus of my political attention to different areas. At the same time, you know, talking about the synchronization and to answer a little bit of what Lisa was asking, yes, we have also to consider that the same process of the synchronization is taking place at a psychological level. It's something that goes into fascism, if you want. You know, this is something that Wilhelm Reich, in his book on fascism and mass psychology, pointed out. It's about that he says that fascism is the result of basically out of sync layers of our unconscious, in which some layers of our unconscious have been left behind because of the very fast development of Western civilization. So what happened is that basically at the level of our awareness and consciousness, we were able to follow more and more innovation and progress, cultural progress. But the unconscious, that is Wilhelm Reich's point, was left behind. That friction, that conflict was used by the fascists, he said, to animate angry feelings and angry passions against the process of modernization and civilization. And I would say it's not so different from what I can see today. You know, there are gigantic innovations that we can follow at the level of our consciousness, but is really our unconscious there or not yet? And again, we are highly educated, so we can try to understand some of these big changes. But I would say a lot of my friends who still live in Latisana, in the small village where I was born, I don't think they follow a lot of our cultural innovations, and they are out of place. They feel left behind. They feel unable to understand our language, the language we are using now. So this is something that either we address, or this friction and tension, instead of producing something beautiful, it will produce new monsters. And I would say this is already happening, but there are monsters everywhere. And I would say, why not? Why not? People get angry, and yeah. And this is the diagnosis that you can find in I think Reich, Fromm, and some of the psychologists who studied fascism in the 30s. They saw this individual readiness for fascism, psychological readiness for fascism at that time.
Okay. I mean, I'm sure there are many more questions and things to discuss, so people are welcome to stay and continue to converse with Professor Tomba, but in the interest of the demands of time and its synchronizations, I have to go. So thank you so much to everyone, and thank you for three presenters.